This area and the border area between Afghanistan and Pakistan is the crucible for global terrorism.
The most powerful man on earth, combating the Taliban in the most dangerous place on earth. Barack Obama's plan to defeat terrorists is like throwing petrol on a fire. The president's dream of peace is straitjacketed by economic policies that incubate the seeds of violence. How did the most powerful man on earth become prisoner of a false economic doctrine which threatens the security of the United States and nations around the world? Capitalism was conceived nearly 500 years ago with a royal act of sacrilege. When Henry VIII demolished the religious life of his nation to enrich himself, he laid the foundations for the kind of violence that now blights every corner of the world.
Henry VIII destroyed 600 monasteries and stole their land. That land was England's welfare system, a social safety net. The monks looked after the poor and the sick, using the food that they grew in the fields around their abbeys. Henry launched the sale of that land to the aristocracy, and the new landlords used the rents to fund opulent lifestyles. But as they gorged themselves in the London salons, the poor and the sick had to fend for themselves. By this one act of sacrilege, Henry incubated a new kind of greed, which knew no limits, and which eventually infected the rest of the world.
While Henry grew obese, living off the fat of the land, hunting deer in his parks, freeborn men and women of England were ejected from their commons, turned into vagabonds, forced to beg their way along the highways.
Henry invented a new kind of statecraft based on greed. This was to become the financial model on which today's nations are built. Instead of using the rents from the lands held by the Crown Estate to fund the public administration, he began to sell that land to his friends and to the money merchants in the City of London. Henry wanted ready cash so that he could build palaces like this one at Hampton Court. And by the end of his reign, he owned 50 palatial homes.
Henry's statecraft laid the foundations for the violent streak in capitalism, a culture of greed that triggered the lust for more land that could never be satisfied. Henry's maritime fleet laid the foundations for what would become the greatest empire in history. Capitalism evolved from a civil war in the 17th century, harnessing wrecking technologies to destroy ancient cultures in the 18th century, mutating from colonialism in the 19th century to fascism in the 20th century. In the past 100 years, wars over territory cost the lives of about 180 million people. The scorch marks of the landed aristocracy's lust for rents can be traced through the violent deeds of history. Portugal, Spain, France, Italy, they all scrambled for their share of other people's natural resources. But to grab land, they first had to displace the tribes that occupied their homelands. By separating people from their land, the foundations of whole communities were destroyed. Resentments were nurtured that would one day put suicide bombers on the streets of London and Madrid.
Around the world, people's hopes were raised when America elected as its president a man whose family came from humble beginnings in Africa. Today, Barack Obama lives in the White House. But his wish to champion a politics of peace will be buried in Pakistan. That's because he walked straight into a trap. That trap was laid by a doctrine that privileges the people and the corporations that own the land.
Pakistan, the country at the frontier of the fight against fanatics. A country weakened by the legacy of British colonialism.
The feudal class is the land-owning class in Pakistan. They have been there since colonial times. During colonial times, at the start, they were small feudals. They were not big feudals. And the British government, the British colonial government at that time would reward those who supported them with gifts of vast lands. If not gifts, then tax-free occupation and use. And when the colonial government began to weaken, they seized that moment to consolidate their holdings.
Pakistan's army is a major owner of land.
They have vast agricultural lands growing all kinds of crops. They have food processing industries. They don't have to worry about food security. They've made themselves secure by taking into hand that much agriculture.
Most Pakistanis struggle for survival on the margins of the economy. President Obama believes that spending $7.5 billion in Pakistan to raise living standards will weaken Islamic fundamentalists. But because of tax policies, this money will deepen poverty in both Pakistan and America and play into the hands of the Taliban.
I think the investment of the United States in Pakistan will achieve nothing, or perhaps worse than nothing. It's a matter of our paying their taxes for them. Now, this kind of horizontal equalization is a name given to taking money from one region and spending it in another. It's been lampooned, and very correctly so, as taking money from poor people in rich places to subsidize rich people in poor places. Pakistan is one of those poor places. But most of the land in Pakistan is held by a tiny minority of the population who collect rent from the others or employ the others to work on their estates. It is one of the more concentrated land ownership patterns in the world. It makes no sense at all for us to tax American workers, especially the lowest income workers, to subsidize these landowners. They can and should pay for their own infrastructure. And if they did, they would be motivated to put their land to better use, because that's the effect of taxing land values.
Governments need to spend money on improved roads and running water. But when they do, the main benefits are turned into higher land prices. In the countryside, this means that tenant farmers have to pay high rents to their landlords. In the towns like Karachi and Islamabad, when US tax dollars are invested, they drive up land prices. The main benefits go into the landlord's pockets. More people are driven into the slums. And it's there that the fundamentalists use the name of Allah to recruit suicide bombers.
But if land values go up due to speculative reasons, then that it will actually cut into economic activity. Manufacturing activities will actually shut down manufacturing and use the land for either housing or other more lucrative purposes. So your industrial sector will shrink. And this is what is happening in Pakistan. Land values have gone up, and there's a very large industrial estate in Karachi called SITE. And if the government can allow construction of housing there, I think 90% of industries will shut down and convert their land into housing.
The Taliban know that landlordism is the major cause of discontent in the fields and urban backstreets.
The relationship between the landowner and the peasant is one of bondage. The peasant is dependent on the landowner for being allowed to work on the land, for being allowed to live on the land. The peasant has indebted to the landowner for his needs. If he needs money for anything, for taking care of an illness, the landlord will give the money, which will be considered as advanced wages. And when the crop comes out, the wages are deducted, and this is where the exploitative relationship sets in. The peasant is uneducated. He does not keep his accounts. The landlord does. And somehow his debts keep multiplying, they never end. And as a result, the entire family is indebted.
The Taliban took control of Pakistan's Swat Valley by driving out the landlords.
When Pakistan's army routed the Taliban in 2009 from the Swat Valley, about 3 million people were displaced across the country. Some of them ended up in this suburb in Karachi, but the security forces won't allow us to go into the streets because it's too dangerous. It's a hornet's nest of drugs pushers, money launderers, even kidnappers.
That cancellation is necessary. It is can be carried out. But some kind of land reforms have to be accompanied by it. Because if we cancel debts and leave them in the same structural position, they will acquire new debts. There has to be a land policy where rural families have a minimum size of land, which of course means that everybody will not get land. We can't have half-acre plots. Agriculture cannot function in that kind of situation. But excess labor in agriculture have to be drawn into urban areas. But then we have to provide jobs in urban areas. We have to have a situation where there is rapid industrialization.
Pakistan's parliament, dominated by feudal landlords, refuses to reform the distribution of income through tax reform.
Pakistan is like a factory where all the sales revenue is used to maintain the head office and the army of security guards. And there is no money left for spare parts and raw materials. That factory will certainly shut down. That is where Pakistan stands today.
Asian countries are not alone in struggling with the legacy of colonialism. In the early 20th century, the lands of the tribes of Morocco were occupied by Spain and France. Today, a suppressed anger explodes hundreds of miles away in the streets of Baghdad.
Scientists used traces of DNA from the streets of Baghdad to identify the suicide bombers. 9 came from this town, Tétouan, in the foothills of the Rif Mountains in Morocco. At least another 21 individuals left this area to seek martyrdom. These young men were disillusioned with the daily struggle to earn a living. The foot soldiers of radical Islam were recruited from the army of the unemployed, whose communities never recovered from the rape of the colonial land grab.
Europeans plundered Africa for her gold, oil, copper and diamonds to feed the culture of greed. Civilized nations invented new strategies of violence. One was the concentration camp. In the 1890s, the De Beers and Kimberley mines generated a fortune in diamond rents. Labour and capital costs were covered by 1/3 or less of the price of the diamonds. 2/3 of the revenue was the rent of this precious natural resource. But the diamond mines were located on land contested by Dutch settlers. During the Boer War, Britain gained the upper hand by herding 110,000 Europeans into 47 concentration camps. Deaths averaged 250 a week. Women and children were among the 27,000 victims. There is no record of how many Africans died in their concentration camps.
Britain was not alone in using concentration camps in Africa. Italy reached across the Mediterranean and used them in Libya. Spain used them in the Caribbean. Concentration camps were essential tools for separating people from their homelands so that the European countries could dominate their territories.
You see the baby? Mm-hmm.
European farmers needed labour to work the land. Mining corporations needed workers to dig below the ground. Africans were corralled to do the dirty work, turned into a captive labour force by wrenching them from ancestral lands. To ensure they remained obedient, their cultures were dismantled. This was the fate of the Muslims of North Africa. Those histories inflame the minds of young people today, turning teenagers into fanatical jihadists.
To make sense of the terrible deeds of violence, such as the mayhem caused by suicide bombers, we need to remind ourselves that people are not naturally disposed to such evil ways. When we dig deep, we discover an anger and a hopelessness which germinates such behaviour. In weighing people's personal responsibilities for their actions, we need to understand how their lives and their communities were damaged by events in the past if we are to shape a better future.
Voices in the past warned of the economics of state violence. Thomas Paine, the 18th century political pamphleteer, denounced the social costs of a financial system that wrecked people's lives.
The landed monopolies produced the greatest evil. It dispossessed more than half the inhabitants of every nation of their natural inheritance without providing for them an indemnification for that loss, and has thereby created a species of poverty and wretchedness that did not exist before.
The landless class was excluded from the riches that funded opulent lifestyles.
The aristocracy are not the farmers who work the land and raise the produce, but are the mere consumers of the rent. They are the drones who exist only for lazy enjoyment.
Today, the economic virus unleashed by Henry VIII is not even recognised. That's why our communities remain divided between people who work, the producers, and those who enjoyed lives of idle luxury, the predators. The predators were able to exploit the producers because they occupied the seats of power in Parliament.
The landed interest in the House of Peers is a combination of aristocratical landholders who oppose their own pecuniary interest to that of farmer and every branch of trade, commerce and manufacture.
Thomas Paine knew that, to retain their hold on the rents of the kingdom, the sovereign power vested in Parliament had to be perverted.
The people must be hoodwinked and held in superstitious ignorance by some bugbear or other.
Taxes were rigged to shift the costs of public services onto wages. In Britain, the aristocracy increased the tax on beer so that they could reduce the land tax.
What will mankind think of the justice of taxation when they know that the tax on beer, from which the aristocracy is exempt, yields revenue nearly equal to the whole of the land tax? The beer, consumed chiefly by the working people, should be subject to a tax that is equal to that on the whole rental of a nation, is a fact not to be paralleled in the history of taxation.
But when Britain's landowners tried to tax the American colonies in the 18th century, the settlers rebelled. Their revolution was based on the right to resist unjust taxes. Armed with John Locke's philosophy of natural rights, the Americans fought their mother country.
John Locke's treatise on the rights of the citizen to overthrow government was at the heart of the American Revolution against the British in the 18th century. When government fails to protect the property of the people, they are entitled to rebel. But no one case of abuse would justify rebellion. But if, as Locke put it, people suffered a long train of abuses, then the people were entitled to rise up and force government out of power.
Thomas Paine's theory of justice also inspired the revolutionaries. People did not owe allegiance to a sovereign that betrayed their welfare.
Britain, with an army to enforce her tyranny, has declared that she has a right to tax. Being bound in that manner is slavery. So unlimited a power can belong only to God.
Paine urged Parliament to switch taxes from people's wages onto the rents of landlords.
Every proprietor of cultivated land owes to the community a ground rent, for I know of no better term to express the idea, for the land which he holds.
Paine wanted the rents spent on pensions for the elderly and to fund the education of children. That financial architecture would dissolve the pandemic of violence that corrodes our civilization. So why, in this age of democracy, are the rents that we all create by working together still used against the mass of the people? Why is the President of the United States using policies that favour landlords, playing straight into the hands of the Taliban?
So this kind of help is actually going to be a hindrance. It's just going to make matters worse. It will bring this contrived war and terror into our rural areas. We don't want his money. I mean, really, he should understand this. we have not been allowed to be independent. We have not allowed to be self-reliant to this day. And you cannot be self-reliant if from the very beginning people tell you that the only way to development and for you to become as advanced as the Western countries is through technology transplanted from the West.